Punishments of the Phu Quoc prison, the coconut tree prison during the Vietnam War. Much has been said and written about the cruelty inflicted on the 600 or so American prisoners of war that were interned at the notorious Hoa Lo prison, also referred to as the Hanoi Hilton. In contrast, very little is known about the depredaties of the half-forgotten coconut tree prison, where not hundreds but tens of thousands of communist captives were physically disfigured, mentally scarred, or murdered by a stomach-churning assortment of evil torture techniques so evil they'd make the devil himself blush. Prison conditions before it became infamous for its prison camp, the island of Phu Quoc in the Gulf of Thailand, with white beaches, crystal clear water and majestic waterfalls, was a renowned sport fishing hunting ground. Even during the Vietnam War, South Vietnamese government officials, including the president and vice president, took vacations here while the jail was operational. For them, it was a paradise getaway. But for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong internees, it was literally hell on earth. First opening in 1949, the original inhabitants of the Coconut Tree Prison were Vietnamese rebels who had opposed the colonial rule of the French. In 1967, and in collaboration with the United States, the jail was extended even further, so communist soldiers, both male and female, could be tortured for information in what would become the biggest South Vietnamese prisoner of war camp. Able to accommodate up to 40,000 inmates at the height of the conflict, Phu Quoc Island was divided into 12 areas subdivided into blocks named A, B, C, and D. For 24 hours a day, each subdivision was guarded by 4 fixed guards and 10 mobile guards who patrolled with dogs. What's more, the compound had watchtowers on every corner, and it was surrounded by 8 layers of intertwined barbed wire fences and minefields, making escape a remote possibility. Between June 1967 to March 1973, more than 4,000 people were tortured to death, and tens of thousands more were left disabled inside the dank chambers of this nightmarish dungeon. This was in clear contravention of the Geneva Convention, signed by both the United States and South Vietnam, which set out specific rules for the humane treatment of prisoners. Even more damningly, these atrocities were allowed to continue despite the fact that there were American advisors posted to Phu Quoc, tasked with making sure human rights were respected. Daily life during their time in Phu Quoc prison, inmates were detained inside tiny outdoor tiger cages of barbed wire that were just 2 meters long and 0.5 meters wide. Confined to a box that was about the size of an office desk, the incarcerated had no other choice but to lie down or sit as they waited for the day's torment to begin. Alternatively, they were packed like sardines in the foul-smelling darkness of an unbearably hot and small metal container. Deprived of light for months on end, whenever anyone came out, they had usually gone blind. Every day, these poor souls were expected to survive on just a small jug of water and 2 small handfuls of rice and salt. Before each paltry meal, it was customary for them to be walloped 5-10 times with a stick by sadistic prison guards. Torture was usually carried out in tiny solitary confinement rooms as small as 27 square meters that could be stuffed with up to 180 people at a time. In fact, there was so little space that prisoners were often forced to take turns standing up so their fellow sufferers could sleep. As there were no toilet facilities, the cells stunk with the overpowering odor of human waste, while the iron-grade walls and tarpaulin ceiling made them insufferably hot when selecting victims. Prison personnel did not discriminate on gender. According to reports of Red Cross investigators, some women prisoners were tortured to the point of hysteria, which is defined as behavior that exhibits overwhelming or unmanageable fear. In fact, throughout its short existence, Phu Quoc prison was inspected a total of 15 times by Red Cross doctors, who characterized the situation there as catastrophic and found evidence that camp commanders had violated at least 12 of the 125 basic articles of the Geneva Convention. Torture methods already exhausted, sleep-deprived, dehydrated, starving, and aching. According to official prison documents, the condemned were subjected to at least 45 cruel methods of torture. Some of the more straightforward techniques included being beaten with fists, clubs, hammers, iron bars with sharp screw points, or, for extra pain, stingray tail. These were particularly agonizing because the sharp grooves wrapped around and became embedded in the naked flesh. Equally, prisoners could also inflict injuries on themselves by being forced to roll around naked on sharp iron bars that caused deep wounds. One of the most excruciating punishments was to break the teeth by hammering them with a wooden stick so that blood constantly spurted from their mouth. The kneecaps were also fair game and could be shattered and broken by hammers while the victim was tied to a chair. The very worst, though, was to hammer nails into the hands, feet, and head of the victim, crucifixion style. This seemed to be particularly lethal, as thousands of nail-studded bodies have been uncovered in mass burial pits around the prison. If they weren't being battered, whipped, or maimed, inmates were buried alive up to their heads and left exposed to the baking hot sun, or they were tied to a wooden board and burned with fire. They could also be fastened to iron pipes that were gradually heated by a fire underneath until they were red hot. Furthermore, on occasion, the torturers would force dissidents to lie flat and either get them to choke on water mixed with soap or chili powder through a tube, or they would point high-powered headlights into their eyes to blind them. Another gruesome act was to submerge the body and head into a barrel of water and hit the walls with a mallet, so they simultaneously choke and have their eardrums pop. Alternatively, they could be deposited inside sacks and then boiled alive in metal pans. Did anyone escape? Faced with the formidable barbed wire fences, 24/7 guard patrols, and watchtowers on every corner, an estimated 3,000 communist soldiers actually managed to break free from Phu Quoc prison. One of the most nail-biting breakouts occurred in 1968 and was orchestrated by a communist guerrilla called Ba Ton. After being captured during the Tet Offensive and transferred to the prison, Ba Ton and 5 of his comrades pulled off one of the most daring feats of the entire war. On the night of June 22nd, after careful observations, the group stripped naked and covered themselves with mud for extra camouflage. On approaching the fence, they unbent the barbed wire with their bare hands, snuck quietly past the defenses, and took flight. A year later, an even more dramatic turn of events would result in the escape of 21 communists. At around the same time as Ba Ton was making a break for it, former revolutionary An Bu and his cellmates had just started secretly digging underneath their holding pen, taking turns digging and guarding in small teams of 3 over the course of 6 months, using only wooden spoons, sticks, and scraps of iron. They hollowed out a tunnel that was around 120 meters long and 0.6 meters wide. In order to avoid detection, many of the men listened out for the footsteps of the guards and warned the diggers using signals. If a presence was heard, everyone quickly rushed back to bed and hid their dirty clothes. On the night of January 21st, 1969, An Bu and 20 of his colleagues wriggled their way to freedom. Once out in the fresh air, they ran to the forest, canoeing across the Gulf of Thailand to the Vietnamese mainland to report to the central government. For those who weren't able to flee with An Bu, release would come 4 years later in 1973 after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. With the conclusion of hostilities, finally came the closure of the despicable Phu Quoc prison, which was arguably the worst place to end up in the Vietnam War in general. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Can Tin, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored.